The baby was coming. It was all so strange. She had been rushed to the hospital after her fall. The doctors and nurses had swarmed around her, all while she was in excruciating pain. The baby was coming. That was the only thought she could muster. The baby was coming. Why? How? She had 3 weeks more. 3 more weeks. But Jared had to come around and ruin everything, just like he always did. Mr. and Mrs. Fuller must have rushed in when they heard the news. In between being drugged up and the excruciating pain she was feeling, she could hear their voices, distant, worried. They kept asking about the baby, not her. She didn't know what happened. It was all hazy. It was a mercy. That was what Lori knew. It was a mercy that fate had decided to wipe her memory, because she wouldn't be able to bear it. She had woken up the next morning. The lights in her hospital room were bright, almost blinding. It took a while adjusting her eyes to the light. When her eyes were finally adjusted, she saw that there was not a single soul in her hospital room. Nobody at all. It wasn't like she was expecting anyone. Mr. and Mrs. Fuller either. They would be too excited with their new baby. They would have their hands full. She tried to move her arms, but she was sore all over. So sore. God, it hurts. She thought as she closed her eyes in pain. She didn't know how long she had closed her eyes, willing herself to go back to sleep just to get rid of the pain. Mercifully, a dark-haired nurse walked in moments later. "You're awake. That's good," she said, and Lori tried to talk, but her throat was so scratchy and dry. She tried to reach out to her nightstand, where there was a bottle of water, but the simple movement caused her immense pain. "Don't worry. I'll get it for you," the nurse said as she took the bottle of water. She poured the water in a small plastic cup next to her nightstand and adjusted Lori's bed so she could sit properly and drink. Lori took 2 sips and stopped. "What happened?" she asked as she looked around. "You passed out right after your cesarean section. You had everybody worried and scared. The doctor thought you wouldn't make it," the nurse said as she dropped the cup back on the nightstand. She examined her vitals while scribbling on her notepad. "Do you remember what happened?" the nurse asked, and Lori shook her head. "I can't seem to remember. I only remember coming here and the pain," she said, and the nurse nodded. "Yes, you were in a lot of pain." The doctor walked in at that moment. He was tall, balding, and had glasses on. Lori felt he looked vaguely familiar. She must have seen him when she got to the hospital. "Good morning, Ms. Wyatt. How are you doing?" he asked, and Lori shrugged. "I don't know how to feel. I'm sore all over. I'm in pain," she said, and the doctor looked at the nurse. They seemed to exchange a look that she knew nothing about. "Ms. Wyatt, you were in a very critical condition when you were rushed in last night." Lori nodded. Of course she was. She had gone into premature labor. "We prepped you for an emergency C-section. The surgery was successful. Unfortunately, the baby died. By our reports, it was distressed and also had a breathing anomaly." Lori was deathly quiet. "The baby didn't make it?" What? What? She said quietly, and the doctor sighed. "We did everything we could, but he didn't have much of a chance in the first place. We suspected that when you went into premature labor," the doctor added, and Lori whimpered. The sound that came out of her mouth wasn't human. It didn't even sound like it came from her. "Where is he now?" she asked, and the doctor sighed. "A Mr. and Mrs. Fuller came to claim his body. They came with documents showing that you had given away your rights to be his mother. They couldn't even wait or let her see him. But, I haven't even seen him yet. They didn't let me see him," she cried out, and the doctor and the nurse exchanged silent looks again. "Ms. Wyatt, you were out for a long time, and legally, they had every right to claim his body." Lori started moving in her bed, ignoring the blinding pain. "Where is he? Where is he now? I want to see my son," she shrieked as she placed one leg on the cold marble floor. The movement alone caused her great pain, but she managed it. The nurse rushed to her side, her strong arm subduing her and trying to drag her back to the bed. "You can't move now, Ms. Wyatt. You're not strong enough yet." She came close to Lori, and Lori slapped her hand away with all her strength. The doctor gave the nurse one look. "Sedate her. She needs to rest," he said as he walked out of the room. Another nurse rushed in at that moment. Lori was still crying, shrieking, and batting away the nurse. The other nurse rushed in and pinned her down. Less than a minute, she felt drowsy and everything went blank. Gabriel Kane paced the corridors of the hospital ward. He was nervous, a little scared, and a bit angry. Susie was crazy, very crazy. She didn't tell him she was going to labor. She wasn't due for another few days. He thought she was in the clear. He had specifically told her to call him if she felt the baby was coming because he felt guilty enough leaving her alone when the baby was so close to being born. Unfortunately, she had chose not to listen to him. He was in New York when Grace's call came in. He had rushed down from New York back home. He got there as fast as he could. He got there in time. The baby was on the way, but had not arrived yet. He was worried. His pack was equally worried, to be honest. Even though he and Susie were a little more than strangers, he still cared for her in his own way. Gabriel had met Susie at the annual Alphas convention that held in Canada. She was part of a different pack, a lesser pack, but she had been making googly eyes at him all through the night of the dinner party. He didn't know her. He didn't know much about her, only that she was a werewolf, albeit a werewolf of lower ranking. He had planned to be on his best behavior, so he ignored all her advances, but she caught up with him later at a bar he went to after the party was over, and they both drank a lot and ended up in an hotel room. He had woken up the next day, naked and already regretting his actions. He left the hotel room before she woke up, dropping off some cash for her on the nightstand so she could get herself home. He didn't even leave a number for her to call. 3 months later, Gabriel was back from a run when his beta gave him his phone claiming he had an urgent call from a strange woman named Susie. He had forgotten all about her by then, but only accepted the call out of courtesy. Susie claimed she was pregnant, and at first he had been outraged, but then he calmed down. He paid for her flight to Denver and made her take a DNA test. It came out positive, the baby was his. Susie vehemently protested to keep it. Gabriel agreed. He had no other intentions. Of course, he was mildly disappointed in himself. It was not often that the alpha of one of the most prestigious packs in the world fathered an illegitimate child. Even his own family had been surprised. Susie moved in quickly. He had no qualms with that. He only made her know her place. Yes, she was the mother of his child, but she would never be his mate or his Luna. Those positions were left unoccupied till his mate came along. Susie tended to ignore that and tried to boss his betas around. Still, he tolerated her excesses because she was the mother of his child. He had left briefly for a business trip only to get the scary call that she had gone into labor. The doctor walked out of the theater, walking briskly while taking off his bloody gloves. He had a grim look on his face. His heartbeat was racing. Mr. Kane. I'm sorry. Gabriel clenched his jaw, bracing himself for the news. We lost the mother. But you have a beautiful baby girl. Though he felt guilty of it, a little bit of his tension slipped away after hearing the last part. Ms. Garcia went into cardiac arrest right after the delivery. We had no idea of her medical history. If we had known, we might have saved her. Gabriel nodded, still at a loss for words. Can I see my daughter now, please? He asked, and the doctor nodded. Soon after, the nurse came out wheeling the baby out of the theater, and Gabriel approached her to look. She was crying, screaming bloody murder, and Gabriel's heart broke at the sound. At the shrill voice. His daughter was going to grow up without a mother. She was going to grow up without Susie. Somewhere in his heart, Gabriel felt like he had already failed her. Despite being heavily sedated, Lori woke up not well rested, and her whole body hurt. Like hell. She had nightmares too. A baby crying, a wrapped baby in a crib crying and crying. And whenever she tried to reach the baby, it felt like the baby strayed farther away from her. The next morning, she didn't feel better, just equally worse. No visitors still. Just a phone call and a text message from her co-worker Bertie, who was asking her when she would get back to work. She had not given her proper notice to why she had missed work. She would text her boss later to inform him. Ugh. She felt sick inside. Truly sick. Worse still, she had a new problem, her boobs. They were huge and rock hard. She touched them and winced. The pain she was feeling was unimaginable. The nurse walked in with her breakfast tray. Weird. She couldn't remember eating the night before. Had she gone to bed hungry? How long was she sedated? Good morning, Lori. How do you feel? Lori shrugged. I feel even worse. My boobs ache so bad, she said as she reached for her tray. She was very hungry. There was chocolate pudding, green beans, and scrambled eggs. Oh, it happens. Sorry about that, but they're going to be very sore for a few days. What? Why? She asked, and the nurse sighed. Well, your body has already prepared itself for a baby, so you're lactating. But I don't have a baby. I lost mine. Lori said bitterly as she stabbed her plastic fork on the green beans, attacking it with ferocity. Yes, I know you did. And it's a horrible thing, really. Her voice was sympathetic, but Lori was sure the woman would never be able to understand the magnitude of pain she was going through. I can offer you a better solution to your aching boobs if you want, the nurse said as she looked at her hopefully. What is that? There is a baby on this floor. She was born the exact same time your baby was born. Sadly, her mother didn't make it. She cried all through the night. We fed her formula, but she's not taking it very well. If you donate your milk, it could help her. Lori sat there for a while. She remembered the cries in her dream. Had she dreamt about a baby crying, or was there a baby truly crying? Yes, Lori said without hesitation, and the nurse widened her eyes. Yes? Are you sure? Lori nodded. I am sure, she said, and the nurse smiled. Thank you. I know how hard this is for you, she said, and Lori scoffed as she looked away. Oh, she had no idea. I will come back with pumps, then have a quick talk with the girl's family to inform them. The nurse left, and Lori had her breakfast quietly. 20 minutes later, the nurse came back with pumps like she had said and talked about how the child's father had quickly agreed. The nurse left with her milk, murmuring something about the milk being screened first. Lori went back to sleep. The doctor came back to do a checkup on her. Her C-section scar was healing quite nicely, he had told her. Lori had murmured something about the hospital bill, and her doctor had told her the Fullers had cleared the hospital bill. Good. Because there was no way she would have paid for it herself. She didn't have a dime to her name. Besides, it was in the agreement that they would settle all hospital bills. She only wished they had let her see him before taking him away. Gabriel didn't leave the hospital. Even though he didn't sleep a wink, he didn't leave. He couldn't just bear the thought of leaving his daughter alone. He had not picked out a name yet, partially because he and Susie had not come up with one. He wanted her name to be perfect. Whatever it is he came up with had to be perfect. After the baby was born and the doctor told him Susie didn't make it, he had quietly made her funeral arrangements. Susie didn't have any family, at least none that he knew of. Her only family was her daughter. He remembered when he first held her in his arms. She had immediately stopped crying as he stroked her head gently. She was so tiny. So tiny. But when she looked at him, when she really looked at him, the world stopped. Nothing else mattered at that point. Gabriel knew at that moment he would fight tooth and nail to protect her. By all tests and count, baby Kane was a healthy child. She was fine, totally fine. The doctor reassured him many times while begging him to go home and get some rest. But why was she still crying? He heard enough of her crying to now recognize the sound of her voice. The nurse said she was hungry. Just hungry. She was taking the formula, but it didn't seem to be enough for her. She was ravenous. Gabriel knew the reason. She wasn't only a baby, she was a pup, a werewolf pup. She would be insatiable. Pups were usually like that while growing up. Unfortunately, Susie's milk that would have sustained her was now gone. Gone. He would be there for her. Always. Good news, Mr. Kane. A nurse walked in the private waiting room where he stayed when his daughter took her naps in the nursery. The nurse had come in earlier to tell him they found a donor for her. A woman who was willing to donate her breast milk. The nurse assured him that after they had screened the breast milk, they would let his daughter have it. He was relieved. Greatly relieved about that. It wouldn't be the same like her mother's, but it would be something. He was so deep in thoughts that he didn't notice his beta and his housekeeper walk in. Oh, Gabriel. I heard the news. I am so sorry, Mrs. Grace said as she ran towards him and hugged him. Gabriel sighed, settling into her hug for a few seconds before pulling away. I am sorry, Gabriel. Deeply sorry. Susie didn't deserve this. She wanted to be a mother, Draco said. Gabriel nodded. Thank you. Her presence would be missed. Her daughter is already missing her, he said, and Mrs. Grace sat next to him. And how is your little girl? She's good. She's very healthy. Mrs. Grace seemed to sigh. Oh, thank the goddess. By the way, you look so tired. We've been waiting for you to come back to the house. Why don't you go home and take a shower and get some rest? She asked, and Gabriel shrugged. I don't want to leave her alone here. Besides, it's only a few more hours and we'll leave. We just want to settle a few things, especially with Susie's body. Susie had no family that he knew. If she had family, she never mentioned them. He had no choice but to take charge of her funeral and bury her in his family crypt. She deserved that honor. I know, but you need some rest. And the full moon is in a few hours. Grace can stay and watch the baby. Gabriel sighed. How could he forget? It was a full moon. All the heightened emotions and stress he was going through was going to make the full moon a lot more worse. Draco was right. He nodded. Fine. I'll leave you in charge, Grace. I'll go talk to the doctor, he said as he stood up and walked out of the waiting room. 2 days later, she was cleared. She could leave, even though she was still sore. She had met a woman named Grace Myler. She seemed to be the caretaker of the little girl who lost her mother. They would come over to her place to pick up the milk every 3 days. The woman was also kind enough to give her pumps, bags to store milk, breast covers, and all kinds of things that would make it easier for her to pump. The arrangement was pretty flexible too. Lori could break it off at any time without any explanation. She liked that. Then the woman had asked her if she would like to see the little girl, and Lori had flat out refused. It would be too much. It was too much, giving so much. She only did it because she knew that the baby genuinely needed her help. And she wanted to help, but no, she would not get attached. She tried to call the Fullers, they wouldn't pick her call. All she wanted from them was a damn explanation. And a location. Her baby's grave. She wanted to see her baby's grave. But no, they wouldn't even give her that right. She left the hospital different from how she came in. The only difference this time was that she was alone. And she was going back to her shitty life and her shitty job. She felt empty. She was empty. Her tummy had gone down drastically. The bump she had 5 days ago was nowhere to be found, just like the baby that was once in her womb. And she looked drained. She remembered standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom on the day she was to be discharged and feeling hollow. She was pale, paler than her Mediterranean skin had ever looked, and her lips were pale. As she applied makeup to conceal her ghostly appearance, she quickly realized that nothing was strong enough to hide the heavy bags under her sunken eyes. It was of no use. There was nothing she could do that would work. Anyone who took one look at her would be able to see that she was hiding something. How would she ever recover from this? It was cruel sometimes. Most times, how life never stopped. It didn't stop for Lori's pain. She couldn't even take the time out to mourn properly, or she would lose her job. So barely 2 days at home, Lori was back at the diner working her shift as usual. Almost as if nothing had happened. Almost as if she didn't just lose a baby last week. It had been 2 weeks, and no, the pain didn't stop. She just found a way to live with it. It was common knowledge to all her coworkers that she was giving the baby up for adoption. Very common knowledge, so when Bertie had found her crying mid-shift in the bathroom, her question had been, "But you never wanted the baby in the first place. I don't understand why you're sad now." Her words were guttural, like a knife severing her insides. She had instantly wiped her tears and went back to work. She had not spoken to Bertie again after that. The only part of her day that seemed to give her a brief moment of joy was when Mrs. Grace came to pick up the milk for the baby. Lori managed to pump in the mornings and after work, then she would bag, date, and freeze the milk. They had agreed on every 3 days, but for some reason Lori couldn't stop producing more milk, so Mrs. Grace sometimes had to come the next day. She wondered if she was making it worse by donating the milk. Mrs. Grace was very kind. Sometimes when she came over to pick up the milk, she'd bring Lori food to eat. Home-cooked meals. Once she brought her lasagna, and the other day it was a key lime pie. She also never seemed to tire about giving Lori progress about the baby, despite the fact that Lori feigned disinterest whenever she talked about the baby. They had finally gotten around to naming her. Her name was Amelia. Amelia Kane. They sometimes called her Emmy for short. Jared had also not come around. Perhaps he was still feeling guilty about everything. After all, if he hadn't pushed her, she wouldn't have gone into premature labor. A part of her was glad that he had stayed away, although, knowing him, he would never stay away for too long. She prayed and hoped that he was away for good now. She needed stability in her life. Stability and normalcy. Jared was a chapter she desperately needed to close. She had been trying to close that chapter for months. "Lori, table 3 needs a refill." Bertie called out, and Lori nodded her head as she walked over to the table with a jug of coffee in her hand. "Hey, I've seen you here before. Didn't you used to be pregnant?" he asked, and Lori nodded. "Yes, I was." The man's eyes raked all over her in a look she knew all too well. "Wow, you look great. I mean, for someone who just had a baby, look smoking hot," he commented, and Lori forced a smile. Unsolicited comments and terrible compliments, it was just the kind of stuff she usually dealt with at the diner. "Thanks," she murmured as she left his table. Hot? She didn't feel hot. Nothing about her felt hot. She was hurt and broken. And she feared that she might never recover from the pain that she was feeling, the brutal gnawing in her chest. She was still deep in her feeling and didn't notice when a man walked into the diner. She was focused on wiping a table that had a kid had made a mess on. "Ms. Wyatt? Are you Ms. Wyatt?" a deep voice asked. Lori didn't even turn. "Yes," she answered. After she was done, she turned and found a tall man right in front of her. She took a small step back. He was tall. Something about his presence was towering. Domineering. Very tall. Probably 6'2", he was wearing a charcoal black suit, tailored and cut to suit every inch of his body. He had short dark hair, his face was clean shaven except for the tiny mustache he kept. He had deeply unsettling blue eyes that looked too blue to be natural. A jaw that could cut through ice and cheekbones so beautiful they made his face look like he was molded by some perfect god. She swallowed hard and looked away, catching herself staring. He had that effect on people, and he was probably happy that he did. "Can we sit and talk somewhere?" he asked, and Lori glanced at Bertie, who was watching her like a hawk. "Right now? I'm on my shift." "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm Gabriel Kane, the father of the little baby you have been donating your milk to these past 2 weeks." "Oh, I'm not due to meet Grace till later today." Lori mused, and the man nodded. "I know. I just wanted to talk to you." Bertie was already approaching them now. Lori glanced at her and scowled. "Okay. I finish in 10 minutes. Can it be after my shift? I'm already on probation, and I don't want to annoy my boss any further," she said, and he nodded. "Okay. I will wait for you in that black car outside," he said as he pointed to the sleek black car that was outside. Without one more word, he walked out of the diner. After her shift, Lori went into the locker room and changed. Good thing she had at least worn something decent. Her faded red dress and old Doc Martens boots were at least still presentable. As she walked out of the diner, Mr. Gabriel Kane was already out of his car and moving to the other side to open the door for her. A gentleman? Wow, surprising. Lori couldn't think of the time a man opened the door for her. As she stepped into the luxury car, she could immediately smell his cologne. She had caught a whiff of it in the diner, but here it was all she could smell in the car. Incredibly sexy, musky, and confident. She smoothed her hand over the leather of the car seat. It was probably worth more than she had ever seen in her entire life. Damn, it must cost a lot. She had suspected that baby Amelia's family was comfortable. She just didn't know they were so rich. "First of all, I want to thank you for your help. Your kindness towards my daughter, even in your own pain, is admirable. I don't know how to ever repay you." Lori shook her head. "I don't need payment, Mr. Kane." Grace had certainly offered. The first day she had come to pick up the milk and she'd JSD seen her apartment complex. She had offered. "I know. And under normal circumstances, I wouldn't offer you, but I have a proposal for you, Ms. Wyatt." "A proposal?" Lori repeated. What could a rich, well-to-do man like Mr. Gabriel Kane possibly have to do with someone like her? "As you already know, Grace is the sole caretaker of my daughter. She has been taking care of her since she was born. Amelia lost her mother at birth." Lori nodded. "But Grace is old and she tires easily. We decided on getting a nanny, and Grace mentioned that you're the only person she would recommend." "A nanny?" Lori exclaimed, and Gabriel nodded. "I will respect your decision to decline, Ms. Wyatt, but I would also be equally relieved if you decide to take on the job. I intend to reward you handsomely for your services," he said as he passed her a contract. Lori took it with shaky hands. Was this really happening? She skimmed through the pages. The sum of $10,000 per month in addition to added benefits hit her. What? $10,000. The requirements were pretty simple. She was to be a live-in nanny, responsible for taking care of Amelia and provide her with love and care. "What do you think?" the man asked, and Lori opened her mouth, but no words came out. Slowly, she cleared her throat and looked at him. He was staring at her intently, watching her every move, her every emotion like a hawk. "I need time to read through the contract and think about your offer," she said as she gulped hard. He nodded. "Fair enough. But you have until tomorrow evening. Here's my card." He handed her a crisp business card. "Once you make your choice, call me. A car would come to pick up you and your luggage." After she got out of his car, she watched him drive away while she clutched the document in mild shock. Amelia Susanna Kane. He liked the name. Amelia, after a childhood friend he lost to cancer, and Susanna after her mother. Finally, he was able to take her home. He went back to the hospital right after the full moon to pick her up. Mrs. Grace was already doing a good job of handling her. She cried less and less, but something told Gabriel that that would be the least of his worries. Amelia was like all babies really. All she really did was eat, sleep, poop, and cry, and Amelia took each and every one of her tasks seriously. She ate a lot. She went through bottles and bottles of milk that even her donor's milk couldn't sustain her. They had to supplement with formula. She slept a lot during the day. So long as nobody in the house made a noise, she would have her nap times uninterrupted. She equally pooped a lot. The first time Gabriel had to change her diaper, he was mortified. He had called the doctor. Was baby poop supposed to be green? The doctor said it was normal. And the smell. Oh, the smell also got everywhere. Her smelly diapers were a menace enough for his delicate werewolf smell. He could sniff them from half a mile away and could also tell without checking her diaper when she needed a diaper change. Amelia had a weird concept of time. She slept during the day and terrorized them in the night. In fact, her first 2 nights in the house, he didn't get any sleep. No matter how or what he tried, he just couldn't get her to sleep through the night, and he tried as much as possible not to bother Grace during the night. She already had enough on her plate during the day. Besides, Grace wasn't even alive in staff. In fact, that was one of the things that made him start to consider the prospects of a nanny. That and the fact that Grace was too old to be taking care of a newborn. Grace had recommended Ms. Wyatt, claiming the young woman could benefit from the arrangement. Besides, she was already donating her milk to her. Gabriel was skeptical, but he had chose to respect Grace's wishes and extend an offer. Loretta Wyatt. The woman was an enigma. There was nothing much he could find on her online, not even a social media account. He ran her information through the city's database, and her information came out and a grainy picture of her on her driver's license. She was 22, young, very young. She had very dark hair and large hazel eyes. She was beautiful, but there was also something dark and mysterious about her. As far as he could see from her information, she had no criminal records, but Gabriel couldn't shake the feeling that that was not all about her. Besides, she had been pregnant. Even though she had lost the baby, she must have family or a partner somewhere. He had his lawyer prepare a contract, one that he was sure anyone would swiftly accept. And after the contract was done, he drove over to Jay's diner where she worked to present it to her. Even from inside his car, parked in the parking lot, he could see her working. She had a small, trim figure. He couldn't believe she was the same woman who had given birth 2 weeks ago. She walked gracefully, elegantly. Her face gave no emotions. She was smart and quick on her feet, but there was a faraway look in her eyes. The look of someone that had given up. He was curious about her. Very curious. Slowly, he walked out of his car and walked towards the diner where she was. As he got closer to her, he caught a whiff of her scent. That was interesting. He could smell herbs with a tinge of blood and a slight lavender scent. He looked at her again. She didn't appear to be bleeding anywhere, except she was on her period. Being a werewolf could be tasking sometimes. It meant that he could smell everything. He could smell sickness in someone's body. He could smell blood. He could smell someone's emotions, like a taste on his tongue. It was much easier for him to detect if the person was a werewolf. A bit harder to detect for a human, but not entirely impossible, especially for him since he was an alpha. His smell, just like the other heightened senses he had, was a gift and a curse. "Ms. Wyatt, are you Ms. Wyatt?" he asked as he stood behind her while she wiped a messy table. Grace called her Lori. He decided to use that instead of her full name. "Yes," she said without even looking back. "Can we sit and talk somewhere?" She finally turned to look at him, and Gabriel felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Just then, he felt a line, like an invisible force had bonded him to the woman in front of him. He swallowed uncomfortably as he watched the woman in front of him. Mate. She was his mate. He looked at her again. There was no inkling in her eyes, no sort of recognition. She must be human, so she wouldn't feel the mating pull. It would be slower for her. It would take her weeks, months even, for her to realize. She had to fall in love with him first before she ever knew. As Gabriel walked back to his car after she told him to wait for her at the end of shift, he was lost in his thoughts. Why? Why her? Ever since he was a young wolf, he always imagined what his mate would be like. He never thought of his mate being any different than him. His mate was a werewolf. His mate was supposed to be a werewolf. The moon goddess tended to work in mysterious ways and created situations like this, but this was a tricky one. He was Alpha. Alpha of one of the best packs to ever exist. Alpha of one of the packs with the strongest bloodlines. How could his Luna be weak? How could his Luna be human? It just didn't make any sense. He would keep it to himself. He would keep the information to himself. At least until he knew what to do with it. A few moments later, she walked out of the diner in a layered red dress and boots. She had loosened her hair out from its ponytail, and she let it flow freely. Without the uniform, she looked much better, prettier even. He came out of his car and went to open the door for her. He could see the surprise on her face, but she didn't say a word. He caught a whiff of her again. The lavender scent seemed stronger now, overpowering. It must be a perfume she donned on. This was going to be hard, very hard. If she was to be Amelia's nanny, then he had to stay further away from her. The stronger the mating bond became, the harder it would be for him to deny the feelings he would have for her. $10,000 a month. Lori had never possessed that much money in her life, or even seen it before. It sounded impossible, almost impossible, that this man would be giving her so much just to be his daughter's nanny. He could have refused Grace and picked anyone else who would be more professional than her. Anyone better. But he was willing to choose her. Perhaps if they knew more about her history, they wouldn't be so willing. Perhaps if they knew what she had done, they wouldn't even offer. She dropped off the contract on her coffee table and picked up her house phone and called the Fullers again. It went to voicemail, like it always did. They were not picking her calls. Lori sighed. Perhaps it was finally time to confront them. She had never been to their house before, but she had the address. She had written it down one time after spying it in a document. The Fullers had been very formal with her, so they had never extended an invitation for her to come over. Perhaps now was the right time. She thought as she walked into her small room and picked out a faded black jeans and large gray t-shirt. She swiped her boots for flats and washed her face before leaving. The Fullers' residence was about 20 minutes away from her place, in a totally different part of the city. She could remember the very first day she had met Mrs. and Fuller. It was the day she had found out she was pregnant. She went to the hospital thinking she had a stomach bug because she couldn't keep any food in, and the doctor has said she was 3 months pregnant. She had irregular periods, so when she kept seeing blood throughout the 3 months, she thought she wasn't pregnant. Her first thought was abortion. She wanted one right away, but she was too far along, and the thought of it alone scared her. The nurse had walked into her room and gave her a pamphlet on adoption. Lori had accepted it and walked out of the hospital room. On her way out, she had bumped into a thin, slender woman. The woman helped her pick up her pamphlet, then she introduced herself. She offered Lori a ride home. Lori at that moment couldn't figure out why she was being so nice to her. The woman had stopped by a fast food restaurant and asked her if she wanted anything to eat. Lori was reluctant to impose, but she was hungry, so she had accepted. While they ate, and Fuller had asked her if she was pregnant and if she was considering adoption. Lori nodded. Then and Fuller had then recounted the story of her life, how she and her husband have been trying to have a baby for 10 years. She stated directly that she would like to adopt Lori's baby. Lori was confused. It all happened so fast. At first she was skeptical, then she had done her research and found out just how many kids in her city alone were waiting for adoption. Lori herself had been in the system, so she knew how it was, she knew how it could be. Then Mrs. Fuller grew more persistent. She would bring Lori food, call her every day to check on her, offered to drive her to her doctor's appointment, and after 3 weeks Lori caved. They were nice people, nice good people. Her baby would be in safe hands. In less than a week a contract was drafted. Lori signed it, relinquishing her rights as a mother immediately the baby was born. The Fullers had stated she would have no contact with the baby, and even if she did, she would not reveal that she was his birth mother. Lori agreed. She agreed to everything. It was for the best, she told herself. He was in better hands. Except when the inevitable happened. The taxi stopped in front of the Fullers' residence, a nice white house with a picket fence, the kind of house you dreamed of having a family in. The lawn was perfectly manicured and the lights were on. The Fullers were home. She rang the doorbell twice before someone came to the door. Mrs. Fuller opened the door. She was wearing a large gray cardigan and sweatpants. "What do you want?" she said harshly as she tried to close the door. "Please wait. Just hear me out," Lori begged. I need to see him. I woke up and they said you had taken him." "See him?" Mrs. Fuller scoffed, readying her robe with anger. "You are not his mother. You relinquished your rights to him, remember?" Lori nodded. I know I did that. But please, can you just let me know where he's buried? I just want to say goodbye." "Goodbye?" Mr. Fuller appeared from behind. There was a scowl on his face. He must have been listening in on their conversation. "You don't even deserve that. You don't deserve anything. You put his life in jeopardy." "Tom," Mrs. Fuller murmured, but he ignored his wife. "You're the fucking reason he's dead," Mr. Fuller shouted. Lori swallowed hard. She wiped away the tears on her face. "Please, I'm begging you. You don't deserve anything from us. After all we've done for you. This is the end. If you come here again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing," Mr. Fuller said as he slammed the door shut. Lori stood outside, waiting, hoping they would come back. They didn't. Slowly she left their front porch, walking slowly towards the street. She would try again. She wouldn't give up. As many times as it took her to. Lori had gone to bed angry and sad. She dreamt again of a crying baby, a baby in a crib that she tried to reach and couldn't reach. She woke up in a fright, sweaty and panting all over. After that, it was hard to fall asleep. She pumped some milk and lay on her bed awake, with her eyes wide open. She went to work as usual, forgetting the contract on her coffee table. Work went by in a drawl. Barely anything memorable happened. When she got back from work and saw the contract on the coffee table, she sighed and picked it up. She looked at the contract again, this time, taking time out to read it word for word, and looked at the business card that it came with. Gabriel Kane, CEO Kane Incorporated. Lori opened up her laptop and decided to look him up while putting a pot on the stove for some ramen. She didn't remember eating anything all afternoon. Only some eggs for breakfast and coffee at the diner. Gabriel Kane, his name, image, and several article links popped up. He was 28 years old. CEO of Kane Inc., a multi-billionaire conglomerate. He came from a large, distinguished family. Unfortunately, his parents were no more. But his grandfather, who was around 97 years, was still alive. He had no siblings, he was an only child, but he had a lot of cousins, so it seemed. He had business everywhere in America and Europe. He had taken over the company at the early age of 20. He didn't finish school until 3 years later. There was no news about his daughter. He must have kept her away from the media then. His pictures popped up. He was often seen with prominent rich people, and there were claims he was part of the rumored cult group The Lords. The Lords was a cult, an elite group made up of only prominent figures all around the world. Though its members didn't affirm or deny the fact that it was a cult, it was said that they held meetings at different secret locations all around the world. No one knew what they did or why they were formed, but they seemed to be a very powerful group. Conspiracy theories had speculated that they were Satanist or part of the infamous Illuminati, but Lori didn't care much for those. Whatever they were and whatever people thought of them, they were a revered cult. Even though Gabriel Kane's life was in the public eye, there was very little about his personal life online. He seemed to seclude himself, living in private and secret locations that were deep in the woods and out of reach to normal people. That was the only aspect of him that seemed strange to Lori. Lori picked up her phone and dialed the number in the business card. She was taking the job. He picked up after the first ring. "Ms. Wyatt," he said, and Lori's eyes widened. How? How do you know that it's me?" she asked, and he seemed to chuckle. "I have been expecting your call," he said. "So what's it going to be, Ms. Wyatt? Are you taking my offer?" Lori took a deep breath and sighed. "Yes, I am," she answered. "Excellent. You resume right away. Please pack your things. My driver will come pick you up in an hour," he said, and Lori nodded. Immediately she dropped off the call. She went to her small bedroom. There was a suitcase she had pushed under the bed. She knelt down and pulled it out. She dusted the suitcase and opened it up on her bed. She went back to the kitchen to switch off her stove. She was too excited to eat. At least for now. She packed her good clothes, all the ones she would need, and a few of her shoes. There was nothing much in her fridge, but she put the frozen bags of milk she had and arranged them into the cooler with ice on it. Then she tidied up her apartment, throwing away the things she didn't need and the things that would get spoiled if left alone for too long. She was taking out the trash when she spotted a black car waiting in front of her apartment complex. The driver approached her. "Are you Ms. Wyatt?" he asked, and she nodded. He was a tall man with a shaved head and sunshades. "I'm Tony, Mr. Kane's chauffeur. He asked me to pick you up," he said, and Lori nodded. "Give me a moment. Let me just bring my suitcase down." The ride was long, longer than she had anticipated. After several minutes, they arrived at a large mansion on the top of a hill. The only way to get to the mansion was a lonely, dark road that led directly to the mansion. Lori wasn't too surprised. Given what she had read about him, these were the kind of locations that Gabriel Kane was used to. Besides, he was a very private man. A home at the top of a hill surrounded by trees was the best place to avoid civilization. Finally, the long lone road came to an end, and there was a wrought iron gate in front of them. The gate opened by default, and the car drove in. The driveway was large, flanked by well-trimmed bushes and figurines. As they neared the house, there was a waterfall at the front, a waterfall with the statue of a large wolfman with its head tilted backwards. Water flowed out of its mouth and paws. Weird. She had never seen such a peculiar sculpture before. The car pulled up in front of the house, and Lori got out while Tony retrieved her suitcase from the trunk of the car. The weather was warm. The mansion looked even bigger than she had imagined. To her left there was another house, notably smaller, perhaps a guest house, and to her right there was a large sprawling lawn with a small garden. Tony took her suitcase right up the front porch, and the door opened automatically, as if someone had been waiting for them. Apparently someone was. A tall, dark man in an impeccable suit. "Hello, Ms. Wyatt. My name is Gregory. I am the butler," he said. "Welcome to the Kane household. I hope the ride here wasn't too uncomfortable." He had a slight British accent and a lovely smile and impeccable white teeth that complemented his dark complexion. Lori instantly felt comfortable with him. "It was good. Thank you," she said as he led her inside. "Wow," she thought as she was led inside the foyer. She took every bit of the house in as they walked in further. Well, it was certainly much more grandiose than she had expected. "You will be taken to your room," You can rest and change for a while. Grace will come to you later and give you the details." She nodded. "Oh!" "Before I forget," she said as she handed him the cooler of frozen breast milk. "For the baby," she said, and the butler nodded as he collected it from her. She was led up the large spiral staircase by another servant, a quiet small woman with short black hair. Despite all the servants' protest, Lori did not let her help with her suitcase, claiming UT would be very heavy for her. And it was. It was equally very heavy. They got to the room at the end of the hall and the woman opened it with a spare key. Inside the room, she opened up the windows and patted the bed. "This is your room, ma'am," she said, and Lori nodded. "Thank you," she said as she looked around. The room was perfect. Not too small and not too big either. There were 2 windows that showed her the view of the back of the mansion. There was a large oval pool and a beach house next to it with even more sprawling grass. Her room had a nightstand, a large 4-poster bed with white sheets, a full-sized mirror, and a small closet with an adjoining bathroom. She walked into the bathroom and sighed, "Oh, it was perfect." White tiles, white sink, a bathtub. She quickly moved to change her clothes. She was torn between picking something comfortable or something more formal. She settled for a gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt. She was going to be living in the house anyway. She didn't have to dress up tight. She was searching for a hairband for her hair when she heard a small knock on the door. "It's me, Grace," an excited voice said from the other side of the door. Lori opened the door and saw Grace standing on the other side of the door grinning at her. Lori couldn't help but smile. Her smile was contagious. "I am so glad you're here. Welcome," she squealed as she walked in. "Are you hungry? Do you need to eat anything?" Lori shook her head. No, I'm fine. Mr. Kane will come later to debrief you. He wants to do it himself. I am so glad you decided to take this job. I just knew you'd be perfect for it." Lori's eyes widened. "Really?" Grace nodded. "Of course. Ever since I saw you at the hospital. Again, I'm very sorry about your son." Lori shrugged. "It's fine. I don't really like to talk about it," she added, and the woman nodded. "It's fine. I understand," she said soberly. "Do you want to meet Amelia? She's napping right now, but I'm sure you can still sneak in to see her. Her nursery is right next to your room." Lori nodded. She might as well see the baby she had been donating milk to for the last few weeks. Her heart was racing as she and Grace left her room and Grace gently opened Amelia's nursery. This was it. This was the moment. The nursery was light and airy. Everything was white, even the walls and the crib. It was the prettiest nursery that Lori had ever seen. It had white walls with a painting of a rainbow on one of the walls. The floor was covered in a thick white rug. There was a large mahogany wardrobe, which Lori presumed served as the closet. There was a changing table next to the door and a drawer next to a large cream couch. A rocking chair was next to the window, and the baby's crib was in the middle of the room, where Amelia slept peacefully. Her crib was white, all white, save for the yellow blanket that was hanging at the edge of it. Lori took a peek. The baby was fast asleep. Her heart tugged as soon as she saw her, and she felt the overwhelming need to hold her. She never had the chance to hold her son. But this baby she could hold. Amelia looked so peaceful in her sleep. Her long dark lashes rested on her chubby cheeks, and she pouted when she slept. It was a beautiful sight, and Lori felt her eyes blurry with tears. A few moments later, Grace led her out of the room. "I know she looks peaceful now, but wait till she wakes up in the night. She has quite the voice," Grace said as soon as they reached the hallway and they were out of earshot. "You must be hungry. I will get you something to eat," Grace said, and Lori nodded. They were almost at the staircase when Lori stopped abruptly. "What was that?" she asked herself as she touched her breasts. The front of her shirt was mildly wet, specifically where her nipples were placed. Grace turned to wonder why she stopped. She looked at her shirt and smiled. That has never happened before," Lori said as she covered the front of her shirt, her cheeks red with embarrassment. Grace shrugged. "It's the hormones, I guess. They can really get to you. I guess seeing the baby caused it." Lori nodded. "Yes, hormones. That seemed to be the only logical explanation for it. I'll go change," she said, and she turned back and walked away. Back inside her room, she found the breast pads that Grace had gifted to her a long time ago. They were in the bottom of the bag full of pumping supplies she had gotten her. She had never had to use them before, but now she did. She sighed as she put on a new bra and then a new blouse. If this happened every time she saw the baby, then it was going to take some time getting used to it. Back downstairs, she found her way to the kitchen where Grace was waiting for her with a plate in hand. "So, what would you like to eat?" I made mashed potatoes. I have a chicken that's cooling off on the rack and some green beans. Lori shrugged. That all sounds very good. I won't mind some. Grace nodded as she went to check on her chicken on the other side of the kitchen. So Grace, any tips for me? Since you used to take care of Amelia. Lori asked and Grace chuckled. Oh, I have plenty, she said as she picked up a knife and started carving the chicken. Amelia is like pretty much any baby. She does every baby thing possible. She sleeps, she eats, she poops, she cries. She doesn't sleep through the night. It's hard, but she doesn't. We've tried everything, Grace commented. She's a pretty happy baby, but sometimes she can cry for hours without wanting anything, like at night, but most times when she cries she needs something. She loves being outside. I used to take her for walks around the house during the day and she would get so calm, especially if she was crying before. Lori nodded, taking mental notes. Overall, I think you'd do great. I am available to show you how and what to do though. Oh, thank you, Grace, Lori said as she placed a plate of herb-roasted chicken, gravy, green beans, and mashed potatoes in front of her. Wow, Lori thought. A meal that was not ramen or toast. Her stomach would be very happy. She didn't know if Grace thought she had experience with kids. But she didn't. She didn't have that much. She remembered taking care of a baby as a teenager, their neighbor's 8-month-old baby that she watched for a few weeks. But that was about all the experience she had. She remembered how to change a diaper, but it had been so long, she was sure she would get the hang of it. The truth was she had not bothered to learn many things about being a mother or caring for a baby because she had put her son up for adoption. She wondered if Grace knew that, if Grace would treat her the same if she knew the truth. If Mr. Kane would treat her differently if he knew the truth, if he would even want her to be his daughter's nanny. Lori ate her meal in silence, while Grace talked and talked on about Amelia. She was still pretty young, only a few weeks old. So there was not much to be known about her other than the fact that she was a newborn. But Lori was appreciative of the tips that Grace was dropping, almost as if she knew that she was really going to need them. After Lori was done with her meal, she went to check on Amelia again. At this point, she was already awake and stretching. Her small head was moving as she was taking in her surroundings and the woman in front of her. Hey, Lori said as quiet as she could muster. Hey, little baby, she whispered as she stretched her hands into her crib and very gently picked her up. She fit snugly in her arms, so snug, almost like she belonged there. Amelia was awake now. Her eyes were bright blue, the same blue like her father's, and they stared at her with all the intensity a newborn could muster. Lori patted her head gently as she cradled her softly. She seemed calm, very calm, and she smelled good. So good! Lori sniffed her gently and cooed. Oh, that baby smell. That lovely intoxicating baby smell. You're just the cutest, Lori said as she touched her nose. Someone walked into the room at that moment and Lori turned quickly thinking it was Grace, but saw Mr. Gabriel Kane there instead. He stood at the doorway for a while, almost as if he was studying her. Good evening, Mr. Kane, Lori said, and the man nodded. He filled up the entire doorway. He was that huge. Ms. Wyatt, I'm glad you took my offer. Lori nodded. How could I refuse? She said in her mind, but kept mute. I'd like to see you downstairs so we can establish some ground rules. Lori nodded. Okay, I'll be there soon, she said, wondering if she had to take the baby along since technically she was now the baby's nanny. Mr. Kane turned, about to leave, then peeked in again. And she needs a diaper change, he said as he closed the door gently behind him. Lori looked at the closed door and then the baby. There's no way she needed a diaper change, she thought as she set the baby down on the changing table and opened up her onesie. She undid her diaper and turned away when the smell and the sight hit her. Okay, he was definitely right. How did she miss that? She asked herself as she picked up a clean diaper that was already on the changing table. Piece of cake. This should be a piece of cake. It wasn't a piece of cake, but she managed to get through it. Remove diaper, use baby wipes, baby powder, and fresh new diaper. That was what she did. After a while, she went back downstairs with the baby and found Mr. Kane waiting for her in the living room. He was seated on the sofa still in his work clothes, his phone in his hand. Grace walked in at that moment, rushing towards Lori. Oh, honey, support her head. You always want to support her head, Grace said as she took the baby from Lori and placed her in the bassinet in the living room. Lori turned to Mr. Kane, her cheeks tinged with color. Please sit down, Lori, he said, and Lori noticed this was the first time he was using her first name. Did you sign the contract I gave you? He asked and she nodded. Yes, I did. I left it upstairs. She had forgotten all about the contract. It was still in her suitcase. Should I go get it? She asked, and Mr. Kane shook his head. Oh no, no need. You can always get that later. Like I said, I'd like to lay ground rules. Lori nodded. Throughout your contract, you will function as a live-in nanny. You're entitled to at least 10 days off for a paid leave in a month of your choosing. I'm sure that's included in the contract. I'm just mentioning it again. Lori nodded. That was true. It was mentioned in the contract. She doubted she would be taking the leave, though. There was nothing else left for her. She had no family, no friends to spend her days off with. You are not allowed to take Amelia out of the house without my permission. Lori nodded, then a question came to mind. What if she's sick? She asked, and he shrugged. You call and tell me first, then I give you the permission to leave. Lori nodded. No visitors allowed. You're not allowed to bring in your friends, family, or any lovers you have over. It is prohibited. Lori nodded again. No problem with that, she murmured. Gabriel heard what she said, but decided to make no comment. There are certain rooms in this house that are prohibited. Please, don't attempt to open any doors to any room that is locked. Strange. What did that mean? She asked herself, but didn't say anything out loud. Also, don't go into the woods. My staff has reported the presence of wild animals in there. Lori nodded. There was little to no problem following that rule. She wasn't going to go there, at least, not with her new busy schedule. Is there anything else, Mr. Kane? She asked, and he shrugged. I don't think there is. If you need anything and I am not around, Grace would provide it for you. After that, he stood up and walked out of the living room, leaving Lori, Grace, and the baby. Gabriel could smell her even before he saw her. He knew what room she was in before Grace told him. A part of him was very relieved that she had decided to take the job, not for anything else really, but the fact that he believed she was most suitable to the job. He had told no one yet that she was his mate, not even his closest advisors. He could imagine the hysteria that would come with making a public announcement, especially with the fact that she wasn't human. How would the elders of his pack approach that? What would the other rivals think of when they heard that he had a weak mate? A human mate? No, it was best to keep Lori away from that. That was until he figured out what to do with her. He had seen her and given her the ground rules, all the while noticing that something about her scent had changed. He couldn't place what exactly it was, but the scent was there. She looked more relaxed now, although he could still see the shadows behind her eyes. How could he not? She just lost her son. She was probably still grieving his loss. It was probably hard for her to cope. Gabriel was in his room undressing when his phone had rang. It was his second in command, Draco. Draco had the habit of calling at weird times, with the worst news too, of course. Gabriel sighed as he dropped his shirt and picked up the phone. What? Where are you? Draco demanded without any prior greeting. That's no way to talk to your Alpha, Draco. Gabriel growled lowly. I'm sorry. I apologize, Alpha. But peace talks with the Scepter Kuan pack went haywire and Alpha Sabine had one of her men attack one of our own. Apparently she was angry that you sent a delegate instead of you coming over. Gabriel hissed. That menace. That completely crazy woman. He thought as he shook his head. We need your order. Do you want us to attack? I can have our wolves do serious damage to her new establishment. Maybe that will teach her some lessons. Gabriel sighed. He was not in the mood for conflict, and Sabine, well, every werewolf in the Americas knew Sabine Reinhardt was always looking for a fight. He'd be stupid to give one to her. Stand down. We'll make a formal report to the Werewolf Council. Let them handle it. Draco groaned, obviously displeased with his Alpha's orders. Do you understand me, Draco? Stand down. He ordered again, and Draco sniffed. Yes, Alpha. I will see you tomorrow morning at the house. Gabriel shook his head. He couldn't let Draco meet Lori, not yet. Draco would figure it all out in a minute. And while he trusted Draco, because of his unwavering loyalty and the blood oath he took to him, he was not quite ready to let him know yet. No, not at the house, at the office. I'm leaving early, he said, whether or not Draco knew that he was lying. Draco didn't mention it. He ended the call shortly after. Gabriel sighed. He had been Alpha of his pack for 10 years. 10 whooping years. His parents had died when he was young, barely 20. Strangely, he had been prepared for his role all his life. As if his father had somehow anticipated his death, he had prepared him to be an Alpha, rigorously. While other kids were going to bed early and doing normal kid stuff like playing, having hobbies, and generally having fun, Gabriel was always training. His father never run out of things to make him do. Running, fighting, meditating, hiking, pushing his wolf form to limits that he didn't know was physically possible, learning how to half shift, fully shift, and learning about his history. He had been taught everything. Most importantly, he was taught how to rule. When he was younger, Gabriel never understood why his father was so hard on him, and he slightly resented him for not letting him know that he had seen his death in the future and intended to prepare his son for the aftermath. His parents died and Gabriel had to rise up to the occasion. He didn't become an alpha without opposition though. For the better part of 2 years, Gabriel fought each and every one of the opposition, distant cousins who thought they had a better claim to being alpha of the pack, his father's beta, other alphas who believed he was weak, and elder werewolves, and the council who thought they could use him as a puppet. They all failed, horribly, and they knew never to rise up against him ever again. He walked towards his door, contemplating his next move, whether or not he would like to see Amelia before bed. He always did. He always put her to bed every night. But now, that would mean that he would see Lori, who from his hearing was rocking Amelia to sleep. He waited for a long time after she had left the nursery and slightly opened the door. His room was not that far from the nursery anyways, which was why he was always on night calls, because Grace slept downstairs when she stayed over, a different wing in the house. He gently and as quietly as he could muster opened the door of the baby room and tiptoed to the crib. The smell of Lori filled the room, mixing with Amelia's soft and sweet baby smell. The room smelled like lavenders, herbs, and this time no blood. He looked at Amelia and smiled at her, resisting the urge to touch her, afraid that she would wake up. She always looked so peaceful in her sleep. In fact, Gabriel didn't know it was possible to love such a tiny pup so fiercely that he was always thinking of how to protect her, and the things he would do to protect her. He was a powerful alpha, and she was the daughter of a powerful alpha. She was his weakness. The gods save whoever decided to use her against him, because he would obliterate them. Lori was left alone with the baby. It gave her an opportunity to learn more about Amelia. Grace only came back to assist her with the bath, and after that Lori got the hang of it. She dressed up the baby and rocked her to sleep on the rocking chair while watching the stars outside the window. She put the sleeping baby in her crib, wondering how easy it was to have gotten her to sleep. She decided to pump after that. She had not pumped all day and her breasts were heavy. Luckily, she had transferred the pump and bags to the baby room, last minute on Grace's request. She sat down at the rocking chair for a while she pumped. Her mind went back to the day she lost her son, her baby boy, and her heart tightened again. He didn't deserve it. He didn't deserve any of it. Lori thought with tears in her eyes. She remembered the events leading up to her labor. She remembered them vividly. She was at her apartment. Jared had followed her from the diner. She was surprised to see him. Last time he had come, he had claimed he wanted nothing to do with her anymore, or the baby she was having, which was quite ironical to be honest, given that Jared was the one who had been tormenting her for years. Jared and Lori were in the same foster homes. They were similar in a few ways. In one, they had both been abandoned at birth by their parents. Mrs. Wyatt wanted children. She wanted lots of it, or so she claimed. She already had 3 foster kids, and one sunny afternoon, she got Jared and Lori. She was getting a fat check for all of them anyways, so it was natural for her to keep getting kids. Lori was a quiet, shy kid, so naturally, she got along with the bad-tempered Mrs. Wyatt. Jared, on the other hand, was a complete menace, but for some reason, Mrs. Wyatt doted on him. She loved him more than she loved the rest of them. He was not only a menace, he was a complete bully. He bullied her and the other younger kids Mrs. Wyatt ended up fostering. Only 3 of them ended up being legally adopted by Mrs. Wyatt: Lori, Jared, and a younger boy named Timothy. All the older kids were eventually sent to other foster homes. Jared picked on Timothy regularly. Timothy was small and timid, just like Lori, so they got their fair share of bullying from the big bad Jared. As time went on, he became worse and left home for long periods of time. He became much worse, and he fell into a very bad gang. By that time, Lori had the good sense to run far away from home. She was 16 then and tired of the way she was living. She was basically the maid for Mrs. Wyatt and her disabled, ailing husband, and the other stream of foster kids Mrs. Wyatt was always keeping to get a steady check. She stole Mrs. Wyatt's money and ran. Luckily, an old lady took her in weeks after she ran away. The woman, being an orphan in the foster care system herself, seemed to understand Lori's predicament. Lori worked regular shifts at the local grocery store to pull her weight around and buy stuff herself. Mrs. Wyatt never looked for her, for if she truly did, she would have found Lori living a few blocks away and attending the same school. Perhaps she never really cared. When Jared got back home 2 years later and learned that she had run away from home and stole money, he got very angry and got it into his head that he needed to punish Lori. Lori left the state after Timothy warned her. It was the last time she had heard from him after he gave her the warning one evening she was working her shift at a local grocery store that was at least 2 miles away from the Wyatt's normal grocery store. Lori didn't even doubt Timothy when he told her. She could see the bruises on his face, and she knew it was the work of Jared. It didn't take her much convincing to flee with what little cash she had. And she'd been fleeing ever since, till he found her a year earlier. She had made her new life for herself in Oklahoma, and she had even enrolled into a local community college. Jared found her and brought her the worst devil she had ever met. Asher. The baby woke her up. She had retired to her bed after pumping and snugged into the covers with the baby monitor to sleep. Lori didn't think she caught a wink of sleep, then the sound of Amelia crying blasted into her ears. She was out of her room in a minute, forgetting she was only wearing a nightshirt and panties. She got to Amelia's room in a flash and picked up the crying baby. She started shushing her by rocking her back and forth, and that seemed to work for a while before she launched into another wail. Oh God, Lori thought as she paled. She was going to wake up everyone at this rate. She thought as she hastily set her down on the changing table to check if she needed a diaper change. No diaper change needed. Just a very fussy baby who might be very hungry. There was no milk in the nursery. Lori had transferred it all to the kitchen downstairs, which now seemed like a bad idea since she would have to go down and get it.